Hey there, this is Joe. Just doing a quick video on my coffee break. I watched Jason Decosta's latest video where he, after he's done mocking Christians and suggesting that nobody shares the gospel, even though more martyrs in our era than all the previous eras combined. But, Jason will say whatever he wants to say in his own little niche. But I want to address something he's saying, that there's, he's trying to establish this idea that there's no universal curse, so therefore there's no need to share the gospel universally, especially anytime actually beyond the first century. So he pointed to a verse in Galatians where Paul says, as many as are under the law are under a curse. So he wants to take that verse and suggests that there was only a curse only for those under the law. Now let me show you how inadequate that logic is. But he's blinded. He's blinded by the logical shortcoming here. So I'm not saying at this point that I'm saying what is true. I'm just going to create a scenario and I'm going to show you that what Paul says is not suggesting that only those under the law are the only ones that are capable of being under a curse. Okay, if you put a backdrop there, and you take a view of universal humanity, because God suggests that he's the one who proclaims, I am the God who created the entire earth. I created all. I am the God of the Gentiles and of the Jews. I mean, he's presented in the Bible as the God of the cosmos. Okay, what if you just suggest that, okay, let's create a scenario where every human being on the face of the earth is under an obligation to live up to God's character and the knowledge of that character that he's put deep within our hearts in terms of our ability to know right from wrong. We know we shouldn't murder. We know we probably shouldn't hate. We know that we should love our neighbor as ourselves. That's a golden rule that's in other cultures that were disconnected from the biblical culture. I mean, there's this sense inside that every time that we act selfishly or do anything selfishly, we feel embarrassment and shame, especially if it's exposed. All right. So let's assume that there's a context, a backdrop, a universal context and backdrop to the story in Galatians, that prior to the law of Moses ever being published to anyone on earth, that there was this general accountability of all humanity to the character and demand of God upon every human. And every human being has fallen short, so therefore they are under a sense of they're liable to be punished. Okay, so there's a cloud of a potential for punishment there. Okay, and we might say that God's wrath is set against all of humanity. Okay, now then God chooses a particular nation, particular people, puts them under a particular instance of a law of God. It's called the law of Moses. And it contains a lot of the same stuff that's in other universal law codes, showing that it contains that common morality that we all have just because we're created by a common creator, given intelligence and a moral intelligence. So he gives one nation this law of Moses that contains all those universal commands, but also on top of that, all the sectarian commands that not all nations have, like don't eat shrimp, don't use cotton and linen together, all this other stuff. So all that in the law of Moses, one people. Okay, and the same principle that's in the universal backdrop is evident in this law of Moses, that if you don't live up to this, you're liable to be punished. So there is a curse. Okay, so Israel breaks the law, and no one can live up to it except Jesus. But so Paul can say, in this scenario that I've put together, Paul can say in Galatians, if you are under the law, everyone who is under the law is under a curse. All right? What does that say about the people against that backdrop, that context? Does it say anything? Nope. It doesn't say anything. It doesn't suggest that they're not under the law. It just doesn't speak about them. It's speaking about, in particular, those that are under the law. And Paul says, as many as are under the law, they are under a curse. But it doesn't overthrow that the backdrop out of which Israel was brought, that they're under a curse as well, because they've broken that universal moral code that's embedded also in the law of Moses. So again, Jason's logic, he's blind he's drawing these logical conclusions without thinking through. And it all right now, because he's trying to fit everything into his paradigm, it all seems crystal clear. But as I've shown you here, Paul says nothing in that verse about the Gentile word. Now you can go to other places, there's a whole story and narrative prior to Israel, okay? There's Noah, there's Adam, okay? So we see all these instances of peoples being at odds with God, Sodom and Gomorrah, says, the Noah's flood story. I mean, all this stuff. And in fact, when Adam sinned, a curse was levied there, and it was a curse on Adam and in his progeny, and on the Eve's progeny, and on the land, on the earth. All right, so and I'm not one to say that Adam was the first human being. I don't believe that. At least I don't now. Maybe I'll change back again someday to believing that he is, but I don't believe that. So there you have it. Here's another one. So an awful lot of people that are under the influence of full preterism, especially more virulent forms like Israel only, they're all saying the same thing, and I said it. We're not under law. We never were under the law. So, we're not. There's no curse, and this is what he put in his video. Well, is that true? Well, look at what Paul said in 1 Corinthians 9:20, 21. 1 Corinthians 9:20. He's a Jew, okay? He's a Jew, and he says that he was at one time in his life he was rising up in the ranks of Judaism above his contemporaries. He was meticulous in his law observance. Well, at that time that he wrote 1 Corinthians 9:20, he said in there clearly, though I am not under the law, and he's talking about the law of Moses, he says clearly, I am no longer under the law of Moses. Now, what's the conclusion that he draws from that? Does he draw antinomianism, that I'm no longer under the law of Moses, so I don't have to worry about anything? Nope. He didn't draw the Jason Decosta logical conclusion. What did he draw? Look in verse 21. He says, to those who are without law, I become as one without law, though I myself am not outside of the law of God, but I am under the law of Christ. So he goes from verse 20 saying, I am not under the law of Moses, to saying in verse 21, although I am not outside of the law of God. Maybe I'm outside of the law of Moses, but I'm not outside the law of God, but I'm under the law of Christ. And what's the law of Christ? It's what he commanded through his apostles. And the New Testament has, the Old Testament, the law of Moses only has like 715 commands. The New Testament has 1,025, I think they've counted. It's over 1,000. So, and these are all commands that came through the apostles or the apostles' associates, and they all boil down to living a life free of selfishness, in love for your neighbor, for your brother, and any violation of that, you're violating Christ. All right, and there's consequences, and hence why the need for grace, the need for forgiveness, the need for the blood of Jesus to cover all sins, not just for those who were under the law, but those who are under, like Paul, under the law of God, within the law of God, under the law of Christ. So that's what Paul said, and that completely overthrows the antinomianism that Jason Decosta is selling, that all his followers are selling, and that a lot of full preterists are starting more and more becoming that way, and that's where I had become, because I was preaching that. And you know, I'm ashamed and embarrassed about it. I could have very well led someone astray, and I hope to be able to correct it in the future. All right, that's it. I'll post this, and we'll see you later.